There are places that wait for you, not in the way people wait with impatience or expectation, but in the way old stone waits, still, certain, holding everything it has ever known inside itself without complaint. Kara Well did not know about waiting places when she was 20 years old. She had never had the luxury of staying still long enough to believe in them. But the world has a way of teaching you the things you need to know, even when you are not ready to learn them. Even when the lesson arrives in the form of an envelope slid under a bedroom door on a gray October morning in a suburb north of Albany, New York. She had been 20 years old for exactly 3 days when she found the envelope. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that later, the specific Tuesdayness of it, the way the light came through the curtains in the flat gray way that Tuesday mornings have, in upstate New York in early October, like the sky cannot quite decide what it wants to do with itself. She had been lying awake for a while already, not because she was anxious, but because she rarely slept past 6, a habit left over from the years she had spent taking care of her mother. When the early hours were the only quiet ones available to her, she heard the soft sound of paper against hardwood floor. She heard footsteps moving away down the hall. She lay there for a moment looking at the ceiling, and then she got up and picked up the envelope. Her name was written on the outside in blue ink in Constance Marr's careful, even handwriting. The kind of handwriting that had spent 40 years writing legal documents and had never fully recovered from the habit. Kara opened it standing by the door in her socks. She read it once, and then she read it again, and then she folded it in half and set it on the dresser and went to the bathroom and washed her face with cold water. The letter was polite. That was what she remembered most clearly later. Not what it said exactly, but the quality of its politeness, the careful, deliberate kindness of it. Constance had written that she had given the matter considerable thought and had come to believe reluctantly that the current arrangement was no longer serving either of them as it should. She had written that she hoped Kara understood this was not a judgment of her character, but simply an acknowledgement that young people needed room to grow in ways that could not happen under someone else's roof. She had written that Kara had 2 weeks and that she was welcome to use the kitchen until then, and that she had always admired Kara's intelligence, even when they had not seen eye to eye on things. She had closed with the words, "where you can make your own decisions without feeling judged." Kara read that line twice. She went downstairs and made toast. 2 slices buttered the way she always made it. She put the kettle on and stood by the window while it heated and watched a blue jay work at something in the yard with focused, aggressive attention. When Constance came downstairs in her bathrobe at 7:15, Kara had already poured the tea and set a cup at Constance's place at the kitchen table. They sat across from each other and ate breakfast in a silence that had been decided without words, by both of them at once. Constance asked if Kara wanted more tea. Kara said no, thank you. Constance looked out the window. Kara ate her toast. When breakfast was over, Constance took her cup to the sink and went back upstairs to dress for her book club. Kara sat at the table for a while longer, her hands around the warm ceramic of her mug, thinking. She had known it was coming. She had known it the way you know when weather is about to change, not from a single sign, but from an accumulation of small things that taken together add up to inevitability. The silences at dinner that had grown longer over the past year. The way Constance's questions about Kara's plans had shifted from curious to careful. The way you phrase things when you have already decided something and are waiting for the other person to arrive at the same conclusion on their own. The specific sound of Constance's sigh, which had become the primary form of communication in the house in the months leading up to the envelope. A soft, contained exhalation that meant everything Constance was too polite to say directly. Kara was not angry about any of it. That was the thing that might have surprised people if there had been anyone around to be surprised. She understood Constance. Constance was a woman who had built her life on order and predictability and the comfort of knowing what was coming next. She had worked for the same law firm for 35 years. She had lived in the same house for 22. She believed in schedules and clean kitchen counters and young people who had 5-year plans written down somewhere specific. Kara had none of those things. She had a job at a used bookstore that paid $11 an hour, a notebook full of stories that she had been adding to since she was 9 years old, and a vague but unshakable sense that she was supposed to be a writer, which Constance had once described not unkindly as an aspiration rather than a plan. She went upstairs and opened her laptop. She had $247 in her bank account. She had been saving carefully for months, not because she had known exactly what she was saving for, but because she had understood at some level that the envelope was coming, and that when it did, she would not want to spend the money on something she could not keep. An apartment required first and last month's rent, a security deposit, a lease she would have to sign in her name, with an income that would barely cover the monthly payments. She had done the math. She had done it more than once. The numbers never worked. What she wanted was something outright, something that once she had it could not be taken away from her. She found a website that listed tax auction properties in upstate New York. She had been there before, browsing the way you browse a bookstore, without any specific book in mind, letting your eyes move over titles until something catches. There were vacant lots in towns she had never heard of. There were half-collapsed mobile homes on flooded land. There were buildings with condemned notices attached to their listing photographs like warning labels, structures that the county had given up on and was selling for the cost of the back taxes owed. She had been through several pages of listings when she found the chapel. It was listed under Herkimer County surplus properties, which was a category she had not looked at before. The listing was short. It described the property as a historic fieldstone chapel, approximately 400 square feet, situated on a 1.5-acre wooded parcel off Old Logging Road, approximately 2 miles east of the town of Little Falls. Access by footpath only. No utilities. No road access by vehicle. Condemned 1974. The starting bid was $1. A note at the bottom of the listing said the property had appeared on the county auction calendar for 11 consecutive years without receiving a bid. There was a single photograph. It was old and grainy, the kind of photograph taken before digital cameras changed what photographs could look like, and it showed a small stone building barely visible through a dense wall of trees. The photograph had been taken in summer or late summer when the foliage was thick and green and had half consumed the building. You could see the roof line steeply pitched. You could see a stone wall, the individual rocks dark with age. You could see just barely the arched frame of a window above what must have been the door. Kara looked at the photograph for a long time. There was something about it she could not immediately name. Not the building itself exactly, but the quality of its presence in the image. The way it sat in the trees with no particular urgency. The way the forest had grown close around it, but not over it, as if there was some unspoken agreement between the stones and the trees about where the boundary was. The building had a shape that was unmistakably what it was. Even in the grainy, washed-out image, even half hidden by decades of unchecked growth, you could see what the person who had built it had intended. A peaked roof, a simple cross at the highest point. The proportions of a place built not for commerce or practicality, but for something else. Something that did not have a practical name. She knew she was going to buy it. She knew this in the same clear, wordless way she had always known the important things, the way she had known the exact day her mother's cancer had changed, from something being fought to something being endured, the way she had known the moment she first walked into the used bookstore on State Street that she was going to spend a significant portion of her life there. The knowing came before the reasoning and did not require it. She took the bus to Little Falls the next morning. The trip took almost 4 hours because she had to transfer twice, once in Schenectady and once in a town called St. Johnsville, where the bus station was a single room attached to a gas station with a hand-painted sign. She had brought a paperback of Marilyn Robinson's Gilead in her canvas bag, a book she had been returning to for the better part of a year, the way some people return to certain prayers or certain songs, not because they have forgotten the words, but because the words mean something different each time. She read it on the bus while the landscape outside the window changed from suburbs to farmland to the low hills and dense forest of the Mohawk Valley. She ate a granola bar in St. Johnsville, waiting for the second bus, and watched 2 boys throw a football in the parking lot of the gas station with the focused intensity that boys bring to throwing things when they are not thinking about being watched. The afternoon light was doing something beautiful, with the maples along the edge of the lot turning them a color of orange that had no name in English, the kind of color that makes you understand why people invent new languages. Little Falls was a small city that had clearly once been a larger one, the kind of place where the architecture still remembered prosperity, even as the streets around it had grown quiet. She found the county courthouse without difficulty, a brick building on Main Street, with American flags flanking the entrance, and the slightly faded dignity of a building that was still doing exactly what it had been built to do, even if the world around it had changed considerably. The clerk's office was on the second floor. The woman behind the counter was in her early 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and the expression of someone who had heard most things and was prepared to hear the rest. Kara gave her the listing number. The woman looked it up in the system and then looked at Kara over the top of her glasses. Her name tag said Dora Specht. "That one," Dora said. She set the listing printout on the counter between them and looked at it the way you look at a thing you have seen many times without particular affection. "You know the situation up there." Kara said she had read the listing. "Reading the listing is not the same as knowing the situation," Dora said. "There's no road, not a road you can drive on. The path from Old Logging Road to the chapel is a mile, and it goes through timberland that belongs to a private company. You'd have to hike in and hike out every time you needed anything. Groceries, supplies, anything." She paused. "There's no electric, no water hookup, no sewer. The condemnation report from 1974 noted significant roof damage, moisture penetration, and compromised flooring in several areas. I'm not telling you this to discourage you. I'm telling you because it's my job to tell you." Kara nodded. "I understand. Where are you coming from?" "Albany." Dora looked at her more carefully then, the look of someone revising an estimate upward. "You're young." 20, Kara said. "You got family up this way?" "No." There was a pause. Dora picked up the listing and looked at it again. Then she put it down. "You said you read the listing. Starting bid is $1. "Yes." Kara reached into the front pocket of her jacket and set a dollar bill on the counter. It was a worn bill, soft from handling one of several she kept folded in her jacket pocket for small purchases. She smoothed it flat with 2 fingers and left it on the counter. Dora looked at the dollar. Then she looked at Kara. Then she pulled a form from a drawer and began filling it in with the practiced efficiency of someone who has filled out the same form many times. "Property's been on the auction calendar since 2013, she said while she wrote. "County acquired it in 1984 for unpaid back taxes. Before that, it belonged to a religious community of some kind. Small group, mostly local, some from farther away. They kept up the property for a while after the community dissolved, but eventually the visits stopped and the taxes went unpaid. And here we are." She pressed a stamp onto the form and pushed it across the counter toward Kara along with a pen. "You'll need to sign twice, there and there. You understand you're buying the property as is. No warranties, no improvements, no liability to the county." "I understand," Kara said again. She signed where she was told to sign. Dora took the form back and looked at it, and then looked at Kara one more time. Her expression had shifted slightly the way a person's expression shifts when they have been thinking about something and arrived at a conclusion they had not expected. "Take care of yourself out there," she said. Her voice was softer than it had been. "There's a hardware store 2 blocks down on Main if you need anything before you head out to the property." Kara thanked her. She picked up her copy of the deed transfer form and folded it carefully and put it in the front cover of her notebook next to the letter from Constance Marr that she had been carrying there since Tuesday morning. She bought a small flashlight at the hardware store and 2 bottles of water and a pair of waterproof work gloves. The man at the counter told her it was supposed to rain Thursday. She thanked him and walked east on Main Street until the storefronts ended and the road became a 2-lane highway cutting through farmland, and then she followed the map on her phone. The walk from town to Old Logging Road took almost 50 minutes. She passed a shuttered tire shop with plywood over the windows and a hand-painted for sale sign that had been there long enough to fade. She passed a diner with a parking lot and a neon sign that said open in orange letters, and through the window, she could see three people sitting at a counter drinking coffee. She passed a farm supply store and a small church with a marquee sign that said something about being the light of the world. Then the road began to climb and the farmland fell away on either side, and the forest came in close maples and birches and the occasional pine. The trees on either side of the road just beginning to reach the fullness of autumn color, the reds and golds layered into the hillside like something that had been painted carefully and then left to dry. Old Logging Road was unmarked from the main road. She almost walked past the turn. It was a gravel track barely wide enough for a vehicle climbing away from the highway at a shallow angle into the trees. She followed it for a quarter mile until it widened into a small turnaround where the gravel ended. At the edge of the turnaround, half buried in dead leaves, was a wooden sign. It had once been painted white. The paint had peeled and cracked and faded until the letters were barely legible, but she crouched down and read them. Chapel of the Quiet Woods. Private. Established 1923. A narrow path led from the turnaround into the forest. It had not been maintained in a very long time. Fallen branches lay across it at irregular intervals, some of them large enough that she had to climb over them or find a way around through the undergrowth on either side. Moss had grown over the center of the path in thick green mats cushioning her footsteps. Tree roots pushed up through the soil in long arching ridges, turning the surface of the path into a kind of rough, natural staircase that climbed gently upward through the trees. She walked slowly. The forest was quiet in the way that forests far from roads are quiet, which is not silent but full of sounds that have nothing to do with people. Wind in the high branches moving through the canopy in long, slow waves. The percussion of a woodpecker somewhere to the left. The soft, distant sound of water running over stones. The intermittent call of a crow she never saw. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine sap. And something deeper underneath both of those, the dark mineral smell of earth that has been shaded and composted for a very long time. It was a smell she associated with nothing from her previous life. It was entirely new to her, and she found to her own surprise that she liked it very much. She crossed a creek on a footbridge made of two split logs set side by side, the wood so old and soft with rot that she tested her weight carefully before trusting it. It held. On the far side of the creek, the path curved around a large granite boulder with a weathered wooden cross propped against it, the cross leaning at an angle that suggested it had been standing there long enough to settle into the earth a little. She stopped and looked at it for a moment without touching it. Someone had made it by hand, notching two pieces of pine and binding them at the joint with wire that had since rusted brown. The wood was silver with age. She passed a clearing where something had once stood. The stone foundation was still there, a rectangle of fitted stones barely 18 inches high, the grass and moss growing dense inside and around it. Whatever had been built on the foundation was long gone. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment, trying to imagine the shape of the building that had once occupied that footprint. Something small, something meant to last. Then she kept walking. The path leveled out for a while and then curved around a dense stand of white birch trees, their bark peeling in long, pale curls like the pages of a book left out in the rain. And then the trees thinned slightly, and the path ended at the edge of a small, natural clearing, and Kara stopped walking and stood very still. The chapel was smaller than she had imagined, smaller and more precise. The walls were fieldstone, each rock chosen and placed with care. The individual stones, gray and brown and dark green with age and lichen, fitted together in a way that spoke of extraordinary patience and skill. The roof was steeply pitched, covered in slate that had turned almost black over the decades, with thick moss growing in the shaded sections along the north face. A simple wooden cross stood at the peak, leaning slightly to the left but still standing. Above the heavy oak double doors set into the stone of the front wall was an arched window, and in the window was stained glass. It was the glass that stopped her. The window was not large, perhaps 3 feet across and 4 feet tall, arched at the top, and the glass had faded and dulled over 50 years of exposure to weather and time. But it still held its colors. Blues layered in different depths from a pale ice blue at the edges to a deep midnight at the center. Golds that caught the diffused October light filtering through the canopy and returned it softly. And at the very center of the window, a small panel of deep red, the color of garnets, the color of things held carefully for a long time. The light came through the glass and fell in soft-colored shapes across the stone threshold of the chapel doors, shifting slightly as the wind moved the branches of the surrounding trees. It was, Kara thought, the most beautiful thing she had seen in a long time. Not beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are trying to be, but beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have simply been themselves for long enough. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a while without moving. She felt something she had not felt since before her mother got sick. She could not have named it precisely. It was not happiness exactly or peace exactly. It was closer to recognition. The feeling of seeing something you did not know you had been looking for until the moment it was in front of you. She felt found, though that was not quite right either because she was the one who had done the finding. The feeling was more reciprocal than that. She felt found and finding at the same time. The watcher finding the place that was meant to be watched over. She walked across the clearing to the oak doors. They were heavy bound with iron hardware that had rusted deep brown, the wood darkened by weather to the color of old tobacco. She put both hands flat against the surface of the right door and pushed. The door moved, slowly, the hinges stiff with decades of disuse protesting with a long, low groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the wood itself, the sound of something waking from a very long sleep. She pushed harder, and the door swung inward, letting out a breath of cool, still air that smelled of old stone and something sweet and musty underneath the deep interior scent of a building that had been breathing slowly for 100 years. She stepped inside. The interior was a single room, perhaps 20 feet long and 15 wide, with a peaked ceiling that rose to the underside of the slate roof. The floor was flagstone, the same gray-brown fieldstone as the outer walls, laid in uneven pieces, with the joints grown over with moss in the shadowed corners. Light entered through the stained glass window above the doors behind her, throwing a slow-moving patchwork of colored light across the stone floor as the afternoon sun shifted through the autumn canopy outside. 4 wooden pews ran along each side of a central aisle, simple and unpainted, the wood dark with age, in the particular darkness that comes from decades of careful oiling by hands that believed the work mattered. At the front of the room stood the altar, a rectangular block of stone, perhaps 3 feet high and 4 feet long, with a wooden cross mounted on the wall above it. The cross was hand-carved, the surface worked smooth with tools and time, and something that looked very much like intention. It was not an ornate cross. It was the cross of a craftsman, not a decorator. Every line in it was deliberate. Kara walked the aisle slowly. The pews creaked faintly as she passed them, as if registering her presence, as if noting that someone was here again after a very long time. She put her fingertips on the back of each pew as she passed, and felt the solidity of the old wood still firm after decades of emptiness and weather. At the altar, she stopped. She put her hand flat on the surface of the stone. It was cool and slightly rough under her palm, the texture of granite that has been exposed to open air for a century. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. The air inside the chapel was cool and still insulated by the thick stone walls from the outdoor temperature, and it had a quality of quietness that was unlike ordinary quiet. It was not simply the absence of sound. It was something more active than that. The room seemed to hold the quiet the way a vessel holds water, as if the quiet were a substance that had been accumulating here for years and years, and the stone walls had been built specifically to contain it. Then she noticed something about the altar. She ran her hand along the top edge of the stone block and felt a change in the surface. A thin line, a seam where the stone of the top surface met the stone of the body below. She leaned down and looked closely at the edge. The top of the altar was a separate piece, a flat capstone fitted onto the main body of the block. The joint was tight, almost invisible from a distance, but under her fingers she could feel the distinct edge of it. She put both hands on the top surface and pushed sideways. Nothing. The stone was heavy and the joint was tight with 50 years of settled dust. She repositioned her hands and pushed again harder this time, putting her body weight into it, the heels of her palms pressing down and forward. There was a moment of resistance, and then a sound, the deep grinding note of stone moving against stone for the first time in a very long time. The capstone shifted. Not far, perhaps 6 inches, but enough. Kara looked down into the gap she had opened. The interior of the altar was hollow. A rectangular cavity had been carved into the stone body of the block, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot deep. The interior was dry, insulated by the stone from moisture and temperature fluctuations in a way that the exterior of the building had never been. And resting in the center of the cavity, sitting on a small raised wooden platform that had been built to keep it off the cold stone floor, was a box. It was dark wood, the surface worn and aged to a deep brown that was almost black in places. The corners were fitted with small brass brackets, tarnished to the color of old pennies. A brass padlock hung from the clasp, and she could see from across the altar that the padlock had rusted nearly solid, the metal swollen and fused with decades of oxidation. She lifted the box out carefully. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the nearest pew and set it down gently, and then went back to the altar and looked around the room for something she could use on the lock. She found it hanging from a hook set into the stone wall beside the altar, an iron poker, the kind made for a fireplace, perhaps 20 inches long with a hooked end. She took it down and went back to the pew and worked the hooked end of the poker under the shackle of the padlock and twisted. The rusted metal resisted for a moment. She put more pressure on the poker. There was a sharp crack and the shackle snapped and the padlock fell free. She set the poker down and sat with the box in her lap for a moment before opening it. The interior of the box was lined with dark velvet that had held its shape remarkably well, the fabric still thick and dense, barely disturbed by the decades. Lying on the velvet were envelopes. She lifted them out carefully and counted them. 17 envelopes, each sealed with a circle of red wax, each addressed in the same careful handwriting in dark ink, to the next soul. Beneath the envelopes, below a small dividing piece of wood, there was money. Paper currency bundled with cotton string, the bills old but intact, their condition preserved by the dry stone chamber. She would count it later. Next to the money, in a small drawstring pouch made of brown leather, was something that shifted and clinked softly when she touched it. She opened the pouch. Gold coins, small and heavy, each one the size of a large button, the surfaces worn slightly smooth with age, but the faces still legible. She held one up to the light coming through the stained glass window and turned it slowly. The profile on the face was not American. The inscription curved around the rim in letters she recognized as English, but in a style that belonged to another era. She would learn later that they were gold sovereigns minted by the British Royal Mint, the dates on the obverses ranging from 1891 to 1933. 34 coins in total. They had been brought to America by someone who had carried them across an ocean and then walked them into these woods and put them in this box in this hollow altar and left them for whoever came next. She set the pouch down carefully on the pew beside her and picked up the topmost envelope. The red wax seal was a simple impression of a cross pressed with something small and round, perhaps a ring. She worked her thumb under the edge of the wax and broke it carefully, keeping the seal mostly intact, and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thin and had yellowed slightly at the edges but was otherwise intact. The handwriting was small and even the letters formed with the consistency of someone who had written a great deal over a lifetime. At the top of the letter, the date June 14th, 1971. Below the date, the address to the next soul. She read, "Whoever finds this chapel, whoever has pushed open the altar stone and lifted out this box from the quiet it has held for years, you are the next caretaker of a small piece of peace in the world." This chapel was built by a man named Father Otto Brandt, a German immigrant who came to these woods in 1923 after the First World War, with grief in his hands and the belief that grief required quiet. He built the chapel alone, one stone at a time, over 4 years, using field stones he pulled from the creeks and hillsides around this clearing. He was not a priest in the formal sense. He was a man who knew what it was to carry something too heavy to put down and too important to drop. A community gathered around Otto in the years that followed. People who had lost things they could not name in polite company. People who needed somewhere to sit without being asked what they were doing there. They came from Little Falls and from farther away. They sat in the pews. They did not always pray. Sometimes they simply sat. Otto did not ask them what they were doing or why. He understood that silence was its own form of ministry, and that the chapel's purpose was not to provide answers, but to provide room. The community held together through the 30s and the 40s and into the 50s. Otto died in 1957. He had been old by then, and the end was quiet and expected, and the community buried him in the clearing behind the caretaker's shelter, which is where I expect he is still. After his death, the community continued for a time, maintained by the remaining members who came on weekends to care for the building and sit in the pews and carry on what Otto had started. But communities of this kind are sustained by the people who build them, and as the years passed, the original members aged and moved away, and the visits grew less frequent, and the path grew over. I am the last. My name is Hester Vane, and I first came to this chapel in the summer of 1944 with my brother who had come home from the Pacific with something wrong behind his eyes that none of us had words for. He sat in these pews for 3 hours without speaking. When we drove home, he said it was the first time in 6 months he had not been afraid. He came back every fall for the rest of his life. I have spent the better part of the last 25 years maintaining this chapel and managing the community's funds, which accumulated over the decades through donations and through the bequests of members who left small sums when they passed. There is more money in this box than the chapel ever needed for its upkeep. The gold coins were Otto's own, carried from Germany in his coat pocket when he emigrated. He never spent them. He said they were not his to spend. They belong to the next generation of caretakers, whoever they might be. I am writing this letter knowing it will be many years before anyone reads it. I am old enough to be honest about that. But I believe, as Otto believed, that this place will find whoever needs to find it. I do not know who you are. I do not know when you are reading this. I know only that if you have found this box, you found it because you were meant to. Take what you need. Keep the chapel if you can. Sit in it when you cannot keep it. The quiet is what matters. Everything else is just walls. With peace, Hester Vane, Little Falls, New York, June 1971. Kara read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and set the envelope on the pew beside the others. Outside, somewhere in the canopy, the crow called once and was silent. She sat for a long time without moving, and she did not move for a long time. Not because she was sad, because she was not, and she needed to understand why. She thought about Constance Marr's letter folded in the front cover of her notebook in her canvas bag. She thought about the flat gray light through the curtains on Tuesday morning. She thought about the granola bar in the bus station in St. Johnsville, the boys throwing the football in the parking lot, the way the light had done something beautiful with the maples that she had noticed and immediately filed away for later. She thought about Dora Specht behind the counter at the county clerk's office, looking at her over the top of those reading glasses with the careful assessment of someone determining whether a young woman was serious or simply had not thought things through. She thought about her mother, about the specific sound of her voice reading aloud in the evenings when Kara was small, the cadences of it, the way certain sentences slowed down when they carried something important. About the small notebook her mother kept in her purse, the one where she wrote down the things Kara said that she wanted to remember. About the last weeks when her mother had been too tired to hold a book, and Kara had read aloud to her from the novels her mother loved, and the way the room had felt during those readings, full and still and complete, in a way that nothing in Kara's life since had managed to replicate. She picked up the box to carry it back out into the light to count the money, and as she lifted it, the box shifted slightly in her hands. The bottom felt different from what she expected. She set the box back on the pew and looked inside more carefully. The velvet lining of the bottom was too high. She pressed it with her fingers and felt something firm and flat beneath, a false bottom. She worked her fingers under the edge of the velvet and lifted it free. Beneath the velvet filling the entire base of the box was a roll of material bound with a piece of wax cord. She lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than it looked, and it was not paper. It was something thicker and more supple, treated in some way to preserve it. And when she unrolled it on the pew beside her, smoothing it flat with both hands, she saw what it was. A drawing. Technical in nature, precise in execution, rendered in dark ink on the treated material with a draftsman's control and detail. It showed the chapel all four elevations in a cross-section, every stone and every wall, indicated individually, every joint and course and angle measured, and notated in a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. Dimensions were marked. Construction details were annotated in small, careful text. There were notes about stone selection, about mortar joints, about the specific angle of the roof pitch, and the method of fitting the slate. It was the complete technical record of how the chapel had been built. Every decision, every detail, a document created not simply to describe the building, but to make it possible for someone else to understand it fully, to maintain it, to repair it correctly, to continue what had been begun. In the lower right corner, in the same small, careful hand as the annotations, was a signature and a statement. Otto Brandt Stonemason, Dusseldorf, Germany, built alone 1923 to 1927. For every man who came home, but never really came home. Kara read the line. She read it again. She sat in the pew with the drawing spread across her knees and the box open beside her. In the late afternoon light coming through the stained glass window, in its slow shifting colors, blues and golds, and that small deep red at the center. And she held the drawing carefully in both hands and thought about a man who had carried grief across an ocean and walked it into these woods and built it stone by stone into something that could hold other people's grief as well as his own. She did not yet understand everything the line meant. She did not yet know the full shape of what Otto Brandt had carried, or what it had cost him, or what he had left hidden inside the walls of the building he had spent 4 years making with his hands. That understanding would come later in pieces, the way the most important things always come. But sitting in the quiet of the chapel with the light moving slowly across the floor, and the forest silent around her, and the drawing of every stone and every wall laid out across her knees, Kara Weld felt something settle in her chest that had not been still in a very long time. She had spent $1. She had come home. The first thing she did was count the money. She did it twice, sitting in the second pew from the front, with the box open beside her, in the afternoon light dimming slowly as the sun moved behind the tree line to the west. The paper currency was bundled in groups, held together with cotton string, the bills old but intact, the ink still clear on the faces of them. She counted each bundle separately and then counted the totals. $21,400. She counted it again to be certain. The number did not change. She put the money back in the box and held the leather pouch with the coins for a while without opening it again. She already knew what was in it. She had seen enough to understand that the box contained more than she had ever held in her life, more than she had ever expected to hold, and that the weight of it was not only physical. She walked out of this chapel into the early evening light and stood in the clearing with the box under her arm and looked up through the canopy at the sky, which had gone the pale gold of late afternoon in October, the color that does not last long and is more beautiful for that reason. The forest was quieter than it had been when she arrived. The wind had dropped. The crow was gone. The only sound was the distant water of the creek she had crossed on the way in, moving steadily over its stones somewhere below in the trees. She did not feel the way she had expected to feel. She had expected something louder inside herself. Excitement or relief or the giddiness that comes when something goes unexpectedly right after a long run of things going wrong. But what she felt was quieter than any of those things. It was something closer to weight. The box was heavy in her arms, and the responsibility inside it was heavier. This was not her money. Not precisely. It had been left by people who had believed in something, and they had left it for whoever came next. And she had come next, and that meant something she would need to think about carefully before she did anything at all. She hiked out the way she had come in. The path was harder to follow in the diminishing light, the shadows pooling under the trees and the moss on the path surface turning dark. She moved slowly and carefully, stepping over the fallen branches she had memorized on the way in, crossing the creek with the same deliberate testing of each board before she committed her weight. By the time she reached the turnaround at the end of Old Logging Road, the sky above the tree line had gone from gold to a pale washed-out gray, and the first stars were becoming visible in the east. She walked back to Little Falls in the near dark. She found the diner she had passed earlier and went inside and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and a plate of eggs and ate without tasting much of anything. The woman behind the counter asked if she was passing through. Kara said she had just bought some property nearby. The woman raised her eyebrows slightly and refilled her coffee without asking anything further, which Kara appreciated. There was a small motel at the edge of town called the Valley Rest. She paid for a room with 2 20s from the cash she had been carrying in her jacket pocket and lay on the bed without undressing and looked at the water stain on the ceiling and thought about everything in the box and about the line at the bottom of Otto Brandt's drawing and about Hester Vane writing her letter in 1971, knowing she was writing to someone she would never meet. She was asleep before 9 and awake before 5, and on the road again by 6:30 with the box wrapped in her jacket inside her canvas bag. She found the boarding house the next day. It was on a residential street 4 blocks from the center of Little Falls, a tall, narrow Victorian with a porch and a hand-lettered sign in the front window that said rooms by the week. The woman who answered the door was in her late 60s with white hair pinned up and the kind of composed, watchful expression that suggested she had been running the house for long enough to know every type of person who was likely to come through it. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She quoted $85 a week, which included the room and access to the shared bathroom on the second floor and the use of the kitchen between 6 and 8 in the morning and 6 and 8 in the evening. She did not ask Kara many questions. She showed her the room, which was small and clean, with a single window that looked out over the backyard and a radiator that knocked when it came on at night but provided genuine warmth. Kara said she would take it. Ruth Calloway nodded and went back downstairs without further ceremony. Kara paid 2 weeks in advance in cash from the money in her jacket pocket, not from the box. She was not going to spend money from the box until she understood what she was supposed to do with it. That was a decision she had made on the walk out of the forest the evening before, not through careful reasoning, but through something more instinctive. The money had been left by people who believed in the chapel. It had been kept for the chapel. She would use it for the chapel and nothing else. She went back to the hardware store on Main Street and spent $60 of her own remaining money on supplies. A stiff brush and a soft brush, a bucket, a bottle of stone cleaner, a tin of beeswax paste, a small pry bar, a coil of rope, work gloves. She arranged to have a bag of dry mortar mix delivered to the trailhead on Old Logging Road, which the man at the hardware store agreed to do for an extra $20, and without obvious enthusiasm for the arrangement, but he agreed. She began walking to the chapel every morning. The mile of path became familiar quickly, the way any repeated journey becomes familiar. The specific routes to step over in the specific places where the ground was soft and her boots sank in. She learned the sound the creek made after rain versus after dry days. She learned that the crow she had heard on the first day was actually 2 crows that kept to the territory around the granite boulder with the rusted cross. And they called to each other in a way that had the quality of a conversation she was not meant to understand. She learned that the white birch trees at the end of the path were the marker that when she saw their pale bark through the remaining foliage, she was 30 seconds from the clearing, and this knowledge became a small, reliable pleasure every morning. She started with the roof. She could see from the ground that several slates had slipped from their positions in the upper courses, leaving gaps where weather could enter. There was also visible damage to the area around the base of the small stone chimney on the north face, where the flashing had either rusted away or been there so briefly it barely counted. She called a roofer in Herkimer whose number she found on a bulletin board at the hardware store. His name was Dennis Pruitt, and he was skeptical when she described the location, but he drove out to Old Logging Road the following Tuesday and hiked in with her to look at the building and stood in the clearing with his hands on his hips. For a long moment, looking up at the roof line, with the professional assessment of someone who has seen a great many things that people have allowed to go wrong. Slate's in better shape than I expected, he said. Trees protect it. You've got 8 or 9 slips in the upper courses on the south face, and the flashing around the chimney base needs to come off and be done over. 2, maybe 3 days of work. She asked him what it would cost. He gave her a number. She said yes. He looked at her sideways. You're going to have to carry materials up that path, he said. I'll bring my guys and the tools, but the slate and the flashing stock need to be at the trailhead. She arranged it. She paid for the materials from the box money, and she helped carry them up the path herself, 3 trips over 2 days before the roofer arrived with his 2-man crew. She watched them work from the clearing below, the 3 of them moving across the steep pitch of the chapel roof with the easy confidence of men who had made a long peace with heights. When they finished on the 3rd afternoon, the foreman stood in the clearing and told her the same thing. That chapel will last another 100 years if you treat it right. She paid him from the box and thanked him. She cleaned the interior over the following 2 weeks. She swept the flagstone floor with a stiff brush and then went over it on her hands and knees with the stone cleaner and the soft brush, working section by section, starting at the back and working toward the altar. The stone was sound under the grime. It responded well to the cleaning the colors in the individual rocks coming back as the surface dried the gray and brown, and the occasional rows of the granite showing through as if the stones were glad to be seen again. She worked the mortar joints with a dry brush to clear out the accumulated debris of decades, the leaf material and dust, and the small castings of insects that had moved through the building over the years. She polished the pews with beeswax. This took several days. She worked each pew individually, applying the wax with a cloth, and then buffing it out by hand, going over each surface twice. The wood was old and dry, and it drank the wax eagerly, the grain darkening and deepening as the oil in the wax penetrated. The smell of warm beeswax filled the interior of the chapel for the duration of this work, sweet and dense and entirely at odds with the cold stone smell of the walls, a combination that she found unexpectedly moving, as if the building were allowing something warm back into itself. She cleaned the stained glass window from both sides. She rigged a short ladder from a log she trimmed and borrowed 2 short sections of pine board from the woodpile she found stacked under a tarp behind the caretaker's shelter to make a platform stable enough to reach the upper sections of the glass. The exterior surface was covered in years of accumulated grime, the colors barely visible from outside. She worked with a soft cloth and warm water and cleaned it in sections from the top down, and the colors came back slowly as she worked the blues and golds emerging from beneath the gray surface layer like things that had been waiting patiently for permission to be seen again. The red at the center of the window came back last and came back brightest. She stood in the clearing afterward and looked at the window from outside and felt something in her throat that she did not try to name. She left the altar unchanged. She did not move Otto's drawing, which she had rolled carefully and rewrapped in its wax covering and placed back in the box for safekeeping. She did not alter the carved wooden cross on the wall above the altar, which needed only gentle cleaning with a dry cloth. She straightened it slightly, which took 2 attempts to get level. She cleaned the small stone niche cut into the wall beside the altar, which was empty and had presumably always been intended to hold a candle. She put a candle in it, a plain white one from the hardware store. She did not light it. She was not transforming the chapel. That was not what she was here to do. What she was here to do was restore it to what it had been, to give back to the building what the years had taken, and then to keep it. That was the word Hester Vane had used. Caretaker. She was here to take care. She found the caretaker's shelter the 3rd week. She had known from Hester Vane's letter that something was behind the chapel, but the vegetation at the back of the clearing was dense, and she had not pushed through it until she had finished with the interior of the main building. When she did, she found the small stone structure set back perhaps 30 feet from the rear wall of the chapel, almost completely screened by a stand of young birches and a wall of wild blackberry canes that had grown up around its base. It was a single room, perhaps 12 feet by 10, built from the same fieldstone as the chapel. But rougher, less finished, the work of a builder who was here to make a shelter rather than a sanctuary. A small stovepipe chimney rose from the south end of the roof, which was not slate but corrugated metal rusted badly in several places, but still largely intact. The interior was dim and smelled strongly of rot and damp. The floor was wood plank, and two of the boards near the door had gone soft and collapsed in the center. There was a small iron stove in the corner that had rusted but retained its basic structure. A crude bed frame made of rough-cut lumber stood against the far wall, the rope webbing that had formed its base long since disintegrated. A writing table, narrow and low, sat under the single small window in the east wall. A wooden chair with a missing spindle leaned against the wall beside the table. She stood in the doorway for a long time looking at it. This was where Otto Brandt had lived. He had built this shelter before he built the chapel, or perhaps alongside it, one room for sleeping and one room for everything else. He had come here from somewhere broken, and he had made these two small buildings with his hands, and he had lived in one and tended the other for the rest of his life. And after him, the members of the small community he had gathered around him had used this shelter when they stayed. And Hester Vane had used it during the years she spent maintaining the building alone, and now it was Kara's. She spent 2 weeks repairing the shelter. She replaced the rotten floorboards with pine planks she bought at a lumberyard in Herkimer and carried up the path on her back in 2 loads. She patched the worst sections of the metal roof with roofing compound she applied with a brush, working in sections on the 2 driest days she had that week. She cleaned the iron stove and replaced the rusted sections of stovepipe with new lengths from the hardware store. She found that the stove still drew properly once the pipe was clear, which she tested with a small controlled fire on a morning when the temperature had dropped enough to make the test feel necessary. She built a bed frame from lumber in the same dimensions as the original, strung with new rope in the traditional pattern, and laid a sleeping pad on top that she had ordered online and had delivered to Ruth Calloway's address. She moved out of the boarding house on the 1st of October. Ruth Calloway shook her hand at the door and told her to come by if she needed anything from town. It was the most personal thing Ruth Calloway had said to her in the 3 weeks she had lived there, and Kara found she meant it as much as anything she had heard in a long time. The shelter was 12 feet by 10 feet, and it had no running water and no electric light, and the stove required fire management she was learning as she went. It was the smallest space she had ever lived in, and it was entirely hers. She kept a bucket of water from the creek by the door for washing. She cooked simple things on the stove. She read by candlelight and wrote by the same light, the yellow flame throwing a soft, warm circle across the page of her notebook, while the dark pressed in around the edges of the single window. She could walk from the shelter to the chapel doors in under a minute, and she did this every morning at first light, opening the heavy oak doors to let the day in, and every evening at dusk, closing them again with the same slow care she had begun to think of as ritual. The first visitor came on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of October. Kara heard her before she saw her, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the leaf-covered path, a cane tapping at regular intervals against roots and stones. She was standing outside the chapel cleaning the iron hinges on the doors when the old woman came around the stand of birches at the edge of the clearing and stopped. She was very old, 80 at least, perhaps older. Small and thin with white hair and a face that had accumulated its years without apology, the kind of face that has passed through most of what life can offer and arrived at a place of settled honesty about all of it. She wore a wool coat and carried a cane with a worn rubber tip, and she stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the chapel for a long moment before she looked at Kara. "I didn't expect anyone to be here," the old woman said. Kara told her the doors were open and she was welcome to go inside. The old woman walked across the clearing and up the 2 stone steps to the threshold and went inside without speaking again. Kara heard the sound of the old woman settling into a pew, the wood creaking under her weight. She went back to cleaning the hinges. An hour passed, perhaps more. The forest was very quiet. A thin rain had begun somewhere above the canopy, not reaching the ground yet, only audible in the high branches. When the old woman came out, she stood for a moment on the threshold and looked at the clearing with the expression of someone who has just set something down after carrying it for a long time. She touched Kara's arm very lightly as she passed. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping this place." She walked back across the clearing and disappeared around the birch trees, and Kara listened to the sound of her cane on the path, regular and diminishing, until it was gone. She stood in front of the open doors for a while after that, looking into the interior of the chapel at the colored light moving across the clean stone floor, at the dark gleam of the polished pews, at the carved wooden cross on the wall above the altar. She went inside and sat in the front pew and was quiet, not thinking about anything specific, just present, just there. It was, she realized, the first time since her mother died that she had sat somewhere without needing to be doing something else. The second visitor came 4 days later. He was younger, somewhere in his middle 30s, wearing hiking gear and carrying a pack that suggested he had been on the trail for at least a day. He had clearly not been looking for the chapel specifically and had found the path by chance while ranging through the timberland to the north. He stood in the clearing with the expression of someone who has come around a corner and found something they had no reason to expect. Kara showed him inside. He sat in the back pew for 20 minutes and said nothing. When he left, he asked if there was somewhere he could leave a note, and she pointed to the small leather pouch she had hung beside the door on a wooden peg. It was a plain pouch she had sewn herself from a scrap of leather bought at the hardware store. He folded a piece of paper from his notebook and put it in the pouch and thanked her and went back down the path. She read the note that evening in the shelter in the candlelight. He had written a single name. Below the name, he had written Korea 1950, and then the words, "I haven't forgotten." She folded the note and put it back in the pouch. By the end of October, the pouch was full, and she replaced it with a larger one, a canvas bag with a drawstring that she hung in the same spot. She read every note that came in, not out of curiosity, but out of a sense that they were being entrusted to her in some way, that being the keeper of the chapel meant being the keeper of what people left in it. Many of the notes contained names. Some of the names had dates beside them. Some had brief words. Some had nothing but the name, as if the name alone was enough, as if putting it somewhere was the entire purpose. She was not advertising. She had no website, no social media presence, no listing of any kind. She had not put up signs at the trailhead or told anyone in town that the chapel was open. She did not know how people were finding it. Later, she understood that it was finding them the way it had always found people, through the way information about places that matter moves through communities at a level below ordinary conversation. Someone who had visited told someone else, or mentioned it in passing, or simply seemed different afterward, in a way that made the other person ask where they had been. She was working one morning in the second week of November, oiling the hinges of the interior side of the chapel doors, when she heard boots on the path. Not the careful steps of the old woman with the cane, but the heavier, more deliberate steps of someone who was walking with purpose and knew where they were going. She went to the door and watched a man come across the clearing. He was old, 70 or beyond, with the solid build of someone who had worked physically for most of their life, carrying the weight of years in his shoulders, and in the way he moved, which was not slow exactly, but considered each step placed with the economy of a man who has learned not to waste effort. He wore work boots and canvas trousers and a wool jacket the color of dead leaves. His hair was gray and cut short, and his hands, she noticed when he got close enough, were the hands of a craftsman, thick at the knuckles with old scars across the backs of them, from a working life that had not always been careful. He stopped in front of the chapel and looked at the building the way someone looks at a thing they have been thinking about for a long time but have not seen before. Not surprised exactly. Prepared but still moved by the actual reality of it. He introduced himself as Harold Goss. He said he had grown up hearing about the chapel from his father, who had come here for many years, and that he had always intended to find the path himself, but had never managed it until now. He had heard in town at the hardware store on Main Street that someone had bought the place and opened the doors, and he had decided it was time. Kara invited him inside. He walked the full length of the chapel, slowly looking at the walls, running his fingers along the stone surface in the careful way of someone who was reading the stone rather than simply touching it. He stopped at the altar and spent a long time looking at it. He crouched down and looked at the joint between the capstone and the altar body, and then straightened up and looked at the cross on the wall above it. Kara had brought Otto's drawing out of the shelter that morning to look at some details of the chimney construction. It was lying unrolled on the front pew. Harold saw it and went still. He picked it up and held it in both hands and looked at it without speaking for what seemed like a very long time. His expression changed in a way she could not fully read, something moving through it that was not quite any single emotion, but several of them at once passing through him in sequence. "Where did you find this?" he asked. She told him about the box in the altar. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the drawing again, at the annotations, at the system of marks and notations that ran along the margins. "These are German stonemasons' marks," he said. "Traditional system, guild marks. You don't see this work in America. The interlocking courses here and here, the way the cornerstones are fitted without mortar at the junction, this is 18th century German technique. I've read about it, but I've never seen it done." He looked at Kara. Whoever built this chapel was not an amateur. He was a master. She told him what she had found at the Little Falls Library, about Otto Brandt's immigration records, about the profession listed on the documents, about the years. Harold stood with the drawing in his hands and looked at the walls of the chapel around them, at the fitted stones and the precise coursing in the angle of the roof where it met the front wall above the window. 4 years, he said, not to her specifically. Alone. He set the drawing down on the pew carefully and walked to the nearest wall and put his palm flat against the surface. He stayed like that for a moment, his hand on the stone looking at it. "My father was named Thomas Goss," he said. "He served in Korea. He never talked about it. None of them did from that generation. You asked why they looked at you like you'd said something in a foreign language." He paused. "He used to disappear every fall for a weekend, sometimes two. He said he was hunting. He didn't own a gun." Kara said nothing. "He died when I was 42, Harold said. "Heart, quick. He didn't leave much behind. A few tools, some furniture, a box of photographs." He took his hand off the wall and turned back toward her. There were no letters, no journal. He never explained himself. Some men from that time didn't. He looked around the chapel once more, taking in the whole of it with the slow, thorough assessment of someone who is committing something to memory. "I think I know where he went on those trips," Harold said. "He came back the next day and the day after that. He brought tools on the third visit, a canvas roll of chisels and a pointing trowel and a small brush. And he walked the exterior of the chapel with her tapping the wall surface in sections with the wooden handle of his trowel. Listening to the sound, the stone returned, identifying sections where water had worked its way in behind the face stones and loosened the backing material. He knew what he was looking for, and he found it efficiently, marking the problem areas with small chalk marks in the same systematic way that Otto Brandt had marked his drawings. He was not taking over. That was the thing she was careful to notice and the thing she came to appreciate about him. He offered what he knew, and then he stepped back and let her decide what to do with it. When she asked questions, he answered them fully and without condescension. When she did not ask questions, he did not volunteer information. He seemed to understand without it being said that this was her place, and that his role here was to help her understand what she had, not to direct her management of it. He taught her to read the wall surface the way a stonemason reads it, through touch and sound as much as sight. He showed her how to mix the pointing mortar to the correct consistency and how to apply it to the open joints without disturbing the surrounding stone. He showed her how to identify a stone that was still sound from one that had begun to fail from within, which was a skill she could only partially learn from instruction and would have to develop over time through repetition. She was grateful for this. She was grateful in the specific way you are grateful for something that arrives at exactly the right moment without fanfare, the way the right word arrives in the right sentence when you are writing, and you did not know you were looking for it until it appeared. It was on his fourth or fifth visit in the late afternoon, when the light through the stained glass window was at its best, that Harold walked the interior and stopped at the front pew and picked up Otto's drawing again. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned it over. He held it up to the window light. The afternoon sun came through the colored glass and fell across the reverse side of the treated material, and in that particular slanted light, something became visible that was not visible in ordinary conditions. Text, written in a smaller hand than the drawings on the front, filling the margins of the reverse side, in lines that ran close together, preserving space with the care of someone who did not know how much they would need. He brought it to Kara. He held it at the angle that made the writing most visible. "Can you read German?" he asked. She could not. He could haltingly from 2 years of it in high school and a period in his working life when he had read extensively about traditional European stone construction, and the texts he wanted were not always translated. He stood with the drawing tilted toward the window light and read, slowly translating in pieces, his voice careful and quiet in the still interior of the chapel. It was a journal, not a full journal, more like the record a man makes when he does not trust himself to remember things in the ordinary way. Dated entries short in a hand that became smaller and more compressed as the pages filled and the available space diminished. The earliest entry was from 1923. The latest she could see was from 1956, 1 year before Otto Brandt died. Harold read her pieces of it. He read her the entry from October 1923 about the first course of stone being laid on the foundation and the difficulty of selecting stones of sufficient size from the creek bed. He read her an entry from 1924 about the timber framing for the roof and the problem of cutting the rafters to the correct angle without machinery. He read her an entry from a spring he could not date precisely about the arrival of the first person Otto had not invited. A man who had simply walked up the path one morning and sat in the unfinished building on a stone and stayed for 2 hours and then left without speaking. And then Harold stopped. He was looking at a section of text near the center of the reverse side. He read it to himself first, his lips moving slightly. Then he read it aloud. It was dated March 1923. Before the building began. It was a single short entry. Otto had written that he had met that morning with a man named Georg Farrow, the owner of the timber company that controlled the land to the north and east of the clearing. He had explained his intention to build a chapel in the clearing and to use it as a place of refuge for himself and for others who might need such a place. He had asked Georg Farrow for permission to use the path across the timber company's land as the means of access to the chapel. Georg Farrow had agreed. The agreement had been made on that morning in that meeting before a single stone had been laid. It had been recorded here in this journal, in this margin, in this hand. March 1923. Harold lowered the drawing and set it on the pew without speaking. Then he did something Kara had not seen him do in the weeks he had been coming to the chapel. He sat down. Not at the end of the pew the way a visitor might. In the middle of it fully the way someone sits when they have stopped managing themselves and simply need to be somewhere. He sat and looked at the wall above the altar and the carved wooden cross and said nothing for a long time. Kara did not speak either. She stood near the window and waited because she understood, without being told, that this was not a moment that required anything from her. When Harold finally spoke, his voice was different from the way it had been. Quieter and with something underneath it that she had not heard there before. He said, "My father never explained himself. Not once in my life did he tell me where he went, or why, or what he was carrying." He was quiet again. The colored light shifted across the pew where he sat as the wind moved the canopy outside. He said, "I used to think it was something about me, that he couldn't talk to me, but it wasn't that." He looked at the wall. He said he came here. Every fall for 20 years he came here and sat in these pews and did whatever it was a man does when he puts something down for a while. And then he drove home and cooked dinner and asked about my school and went to bed and got up and did it again. All those years. All of that. He stood slowly the way men of his age stand when their joints have been still for a while. He looked at the drawing on the pew beside him. He looked at the walls of the chapel around him with the expression of someone who has finally, after a very long time, understood something about a person they loved. He said, "He couldn't give me the words, but he gave me this. He just didn't know he was doing it." He picked up the drawing and handed it back to Kara carefully, and she took it, and outside the raven that had moved into the clearing territory called once from the maples and was quiet, and the clearing held the stillness that follows the arrival of something that has been a long time coming. The letter from Crestwood Timber arrived at Ruth Calloway's address on a Thursday morning in the third week of November. Ruth brought it out to the trailhead herself, which was a thing she had never done before, and Kara knew from the look on Ruth's face when she appeared at the edge of the parking turnaround, that the envelope contained something that required a face rather than a mailbox. It was a legal letter, 4 pages single-spaced on the letterhead of a firm in Utica called Farrow and Associates. The lead name was Glenn Farrow. The letter stated in the careful language of documents designed to be precise, without being readable, that Crestwood Timber, LLC, was the sole owner of the timber parcel designated in the Herkimer County land records as Lot 14, Section 7 Old Logging Road Corridor, and that the footpath crossing said parcel from County Road 167 to the property recently transferred to one Kara Weld constituted unauthorized use of private land. It stated that no recorded easement existed in the Herkimer County land records, granting right of passage across Lot 14 to any party. It stated that Crestwood was prepared to offer Ms. Weld 60 days to resolve the matter through one of two means, either the purchase of a formal easement at a rate to be negotiated, or the purchase of the chapel property itself at a price of $50,000, which Crestwood considered a fair market valuation given the property's condition and the absence of legal access. At the bottom of the 4th page below the signature, a handwritten line had been added in blue ink. It said, "We would prefer to resolve this amicably." Kara read the letter twice, standing at the trailhead with Ruth Calloway watching her. Then she folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket next to her notebook. "Bad," Ruth said. Kara told her what it said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She was a woman who did not rush to fill silence with words, which was one of the things Kara had come to appreciate about her in the months since moving out of the boarding house. "Glenn Farrow," Ruth said. "His grandfather started Crestwood. His father ran it after. Glenn took over about 15 years ago." She paused. "He's not a bad man necessarily. He's a businessman. There's a difference, though. Some days it doesn't feel like one." Kara thanked her and picked up her pack and started up the path. She needed to think, and she thought best when her feet were moving. She walked the mile to the chapel without stopping and went inside and sat in the front pew with the letter open on her knees and looked at the wall above the altar and the carved wooden cross that Otto Brandt had made with his own hands in 1927. The morning light was coming through the stained glass window behind her, the colors moving across the stone floor in the slow way she had come to mark time by. The letter said no recorded easement existed in the county land records. That was the specific language. Recorded. The agreement Otto Brandt had made with Georg Farrow in March of 1923 had never been filed with the county. It existed in Otto's journal, written in German, in the margin of a technical drawing that had been sealed in a box in a hollow altar for 50 years. It was real, but it was not recorded, and in the world of property law, there was a significant distance between those two things. She did not panic. She noticed the absence of panic in herself and found it interesting. There was something in the chapel that made catastrophizing difficult, as if the stone walls had an effect on the nervous system that was not entirely metaphorical. She sat in the pew and thought clearly and without drama about what she had and what she needed. She had the drawing with Otto's journal on the reverse side. She had Harold, who could read it. She had the letter from Hester Vane, which established the history of the community and the chapel. She had the legal deed of sale from Herkimer County. What she did not have was a lawyer. Harold arrived 2 hours later. She had not called him. He simply came the way he had been coming most mornings since the first visit, walking the path with the steady, deliberate pace she had come to recognize by sound before she could see him through the trees. He came around the birches and saw her sitting on the stone bench outside the chapel door with the letter in her hand, and he crossed the clearing without hurrying and sat down beside her on the bench and read it when she handed it to him. He read all 4 pages. He read some sections twice. Then he folded it along her folds and handed it back. "Georg Farrow," he said. "His grandfather," Kara said. Harold was quiet for a moment. The raven called from somewhere in the maples on the north side of the clearing once, and then again its voice like something that needed oiling. "There's a lawyer in Herkimer," Harold said. "Elaine Dodd. She does property work, historic preservation cases mostly. She took on a case 2 years ago involving an old mill property up near Dolgeville, Some dispute about riparian rights going back to the 1890s. She won. He paused. She does some work pro bono for cases she considers worth it. Kara said she appreciated that. I'll call her today, Harold said. Kara told him she would call Elaine Dodd herself. Harold looked at her for a moment and then nodded once and did not offer again. Elaine Dodd was in her late 40s with a direct manner and the ability to listen to everything without visibly reacting to any of it until she had heard all of it. She came to Little Falls the following Monday and hiked into the chapel with Kara carrying a leather satchel and wearing sensible boots and moving through the forest without complaint. She spent 2 hours in the chapel in the shelter, reading through the contents of the box and examining Otto's drawing with a magnifying lens she produced from her satchel. She asked careful, specific questions and wrote the answers in a notebook. She photographed everything with her phone, the letter, the drawing. Hester Vane's letter, the individual envelopes, the easement record that Kara had found when she had spent a day at the Herkimer County Clerk's office going through the property files. That record was a document from 1952, a formal easement filed with the county by the then owner of Crestwood Timber, a man named Aldous Farrow, confirming the right of passage across Lot 14 to what the document described as the chapel community of Little Falls. It had been properly recorded and was in the county files. Crestwood's letter claimed no easement existed. Either Glenn Farrow's lawyers had done inadequate research or they had found it and chosen not to acknowledge it, which was a different kind of problem. Elaine Dodd looked at the 1952 document for a long time. "This is your primary instrument," she said. "Recorded, unambiguous, specific. Crestwood's argument that no easement exists is factually incorrect. Their secondary argument might be that the easement lapsed through non-use, which is a real doctrine in New York property law. If the beneficiary community ceased to use the access for an extended period, a court could find the easement abandoned." She paused. "Do you have any evidence of continuous use?" Kara thought about Thomas Goss, about Harold's description of his father disappearing each fall for 20 years with no gun and no explanation. About the note in the leather pouch, written by a man who had come here on some autumn weekend, Korea, 1950. "I haven't forgotten." She told Elaine about Harold, about his father, about the notes in the pouch and the way people had been finding the chapel since she had opened the doors without advertising through the same invisible channels that had been bringing people here for decades. Elaine wrote carefully in her notebook. "I'll need Harold Goss to make a statement," she said, "testifying to his father's use of the access path that dates the duration. That's continuous use. That argues against abandonment." Kara said she would ask him. Elaine looked at her across the table in the shelter where they were sitting with the contents of the box laid out between them. Outside, the late November light was going thin and gray through the small window. "One more thing," Elaine said. She picked up the drawing and turned it over carefully to the journal side, which she had been the most interested in since Harold had translated sections of it over the phone earlier that week. The entry from March 1923, the meeting with Georg Farrow, the agreement made before construction began. She set the drawing down. "If we can get that entry properly translated, certified, and presented to the court, we have something more significant than the 1952 easement. We have evidence that the right of access was established as a foundational condition of the chapel's existence, before the first stone was laid. The 1952 document was a formalization of something that already existed, not the origin of it. That changes the legal character of the easement significantly." She closed her notebook. "I'll take the case," she said. She did not name a fee. Kara filed the response to Crestwood's notice through Elaine's office in the first week of December. The response acknowledged the letter cited the 1952 recorded easement, presented Otto's journal entry with a certified translation by a professor of German at SUNY Albany, whom Elaine had contacted through her network, and formally objected to any interference with access to the chapel property. It requested a hearing before the Herkimer County Property Court at the earliest available date. Glenn Farrow's office responded within 10 days with a counterfiling. The counterfiling argued, as Elaine had anticipated, that the 1952 easement had lapsed through continuous non-use following the dissolution of the chapel community of Little Falls, citing the county's condemnation of the property in 1974 and the cessation of regular access thereafter. It did not address the 1923 journal entry. The hearing was scheduled for the third week of January. December was cold. The temperatures dropped below freezing in the first week and stayed there the nights getting long and the days short and pale. The light through the stained glass window reduced by the early dusk to a brief, beautiful thing that Kara found herself watching with more attention because it lasted such a short time. She kept the chapel doors open every day, regardless of the weather, closing them in the evenings. She kept the stove in the shelter burning at night and stacked a serious quantity of wood against the shelter's south wall. Before the hard cold arrived, Harold helping her carry it in from the woodpile she had built up over the fall from downed material along the path. The visitors kept coming, fewer in the cold than in the warmer months, but they came. She saw their breath in the air inside the chapel on the coldest mornings. She watched people sit in the pews wrapped in their coats and scarves, their faces turned toward the altar with expressions that were not looking at anything visible. The notes in the canvas pouch accumulated. She replaced it with a small wooden box she made from scrap lumber, lined with the same dark velvet she had found in the bottom of Otto's box. She set it on a small shelf she attached to the wall beside the door. She was not lonely. She noticed this because she had expected to be. She was 20 years old and living alone in a 12 by 10 stone shelter in the middle of a forest in upstate New York in December, with no electricity and no company and no social life in any recognizable form. By every external measure, the conditions for loneliness were ideal. But the chapel was never really empty, even when no one was in it. And the shelter had a quality of inhabited warmth that the boarding house room in Little Falls had never managed. She wrote every evening until the candle burned low. She read until her eyes were tired. She slept deeply and woke early and was most mornings genuinely glad to be exactly where she was. Harold came to the hearing. He had prepared a written statement with Elaine's help detailing what he knew of his father's visits to the chapel, the years, the frequency, the duration. He knew the years because his mother had kept a simple calendar each year and had marked Thomas Goss's absences on it, not with explanation, but with a small notation that said, "T gone," which had been her way of managing the household in his absence. Harold had found 5 of these calendars in a box after his father died. The calendars covered the years from 1955 to 1974, which was the year of the condemnation. 19 years of documented autumn visits. He brought the calendars to court in a manila folder. The Herkimer County Property Court was a small courtroom on the 3rd floor of the same brick courthouse where Kara had filed her deed 4 months earlier. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Holst, who had the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had spent 30 years sorting out the property disputes of a rural county and had developed a comprehensive understanding of human nature in the process. Glenn Farrow was present with 2 lawyers from his Utica firm. He was in his mid-50s, a solid business-like man in a good coat, with the kind of face that managed to be both neutral and determined at once. He looked at Kara once when she came in and then did not look at her again for most of the morning. Elaine presented the 1952 easement. She presented the certified translation of Otto's 1923 journal entry. She presented Harold's statement, and Harold himself, who took the stand and answered questions in the careful, measured way of a man who is not comfortable with formality but is committed to precision. He explained his father's visits. He explained the calendars. He explained when the judge asked him directly how he had come to understand where his father had been going on those trips. Harold said, "My father served in Korea, and he never talked about it the way men of his generation didn't talk about those things. But for 19 years, he came up here every fall, and now I know where he went, and I think I understand why. He came here because it was somewhere he could put it down, whatever he was carrying, just for a little while." The courtroom was very quiet for a moment after he said this. Glenn Farrow's lawyers argued the abandonment doctrine. They were technically competent, and they presented the argument clearly. The condemnation in 1974, the cessation of regular access afterward, the 10-year gap between the last documented community visit and the county's acquisition of the property. The 11 years the property had sat on the auction calendar with no takers. Elaine addressed each point. The condemnation had not terminated the easement which ran with the land. Harold's calendars demonstrated continuous use through 1974, the full period of the community's active existence. The property's period on the auction calendar was a function of its unusual character, not evidence of community abandonment. And the 1923 journal entry established a foundational agreement that predated the 1952 recorded instrument, suggesting the easement was not merely a document, but an original condition of the property's existence as a place of access and refuge. Judge Holst asked to see Otto's drawing. She held it and looked at the front and then the back, the journal side examining it with the reading glasses she put on for the purpose. She spent considerable time with the translated text that Elaine had submitted as an exhibit, reading it with the same deliberate attention she had given to the legal arguments. She asked no further questions. She said she would take the matter under advisement and deliver a ruling within 10 business days. Glenn Farrow was the first one out of the courtroom. Kara watched him go from across the room. He had his coat over his arm, and he walked with the purposeful stride of a man with other places to be. At the door, he paused for a moment, one hand on the frame, and seemed to consider something. He did not turn around. He simply stood there for the length of 2 or 3 breaths, and then he went through the door and was gone. Kara did not know what he had been thinking in that moment. She thought about it for a while and then decided it did not matter, and then thought about it again later and decided that maybe it did a little. Kara walked out of the courthouse into the January cold and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the sky, which was a hard, clear blue with no clouds, the kind of January blue that is beautiful in inverse proportion to how cold it is. Harold came out behind her and stood beside her on the sidewalk without speaking. She said, "Thank you." He said my father would have come to court himself if he'd needed to. They drove back to Little Falls in Harold's truck in the comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to discuss it immediately. The ruling came in 9 days. Judge Holst found in favor of the chapel. She found that the 1952 easement was valid and unambiguous and had not lapsed through abandonment, citing Harold's documented testimony as evidence of continuous use through the period in question. She found further in an additional passage that Elaine said was unusual for a property ruling that the 1923 journal entry, while not itself a recorded legal instrument, provided compelling historical evidence of the foundational intent of the access agreement, which the court considered relevant to the interpretation of the 1952 document's character and force. The easement was confirmed as permanent and binding. Crestwood Timber did not appeal. Elaine called Kara with the news and said in her careful way that she believed Crestwood's decision not to appeal was less a legal calculation than a practical one. The story of a 20-year-old girl living alone in a stone shelter in the Adirondack foothills, spending her own money to restore a 100-year-old chapel, being sued by a timber company for using a footpath, was not the kind of story a large corporation wanted to see developed by a news outlet looking for a feature in the quiet weeks of January. Some battles, Elaine said, are won because the other side decides the cost of winning is too high. Kara thanked her. Elaine said the pro bono had been a genuine pleasure, and that if anyone ever asked her for a case that had made her glad to be a lawyer, she would think of this one. The winter deepened, and then as winters in upstate New York eventually began its slow withdrawal. The days lengthened by increments. The light through the stained glass window lasted a little longer. Each afternoon, the colors holding onto the stone floor with less urgency as the dusk backed away. The snow came in February in a serious, quiet way that covered the clearing and the path and the roof of the chapel in a uniform white that made the building look like something from a photograph taken a century ago. She dug out the path after each snowfall. She brought a wider shovel up from town and kept it in the shelter. She began to learn the stones the way Harold had taught her. She spent time each week walking the exterior of the building, touching the surface, tapping with the wooden handle of the pointing trowel, listening. She began to know the wall the way you know the face of something you have been attending to closely, not in its totality, but in its particulars. The specific place on the north face where a course of stones had settled slightly and needed new pointing in the spring. The corner on the east side where the foundation had heaved slightly from freeze-thaw cycles over the decades and the base course needed monitoring. The building was telling her what it needed, and she was learning to hear it. It was Harold who found the hidden cavity in the wall. He was there on a morning in late February, working on a section of the interior wall near the altar that had shown signs of moisture intrusion, carefully removing a facing stone that had separated from the backing and needed to be reset. He had the stone out and was clearing the backing material when he stopped. Kara was at the other end of the chapel, polishing the pews, and she heard the change in his movement, the quality of stillness that replaced the regular sounds of his work. She looked up. Harold was standing at the open space in the wall with his hands at his sides. She walked to the front of the chapel and stood beside him and looked into the cavity that the removed stone had exposed. It was not large, perhaps 18 inches wide and a foot deep, set back into the wall at a height that placed its center at about the level of a man's chest. It had not been accidental. The stones around it were finished on their inner faces, the edges deliberately shaped to create the smooth walls of an intentional space. Someone had built this into the wall when the wall was being built. It had been designed to be here and designed to be closed. Inside the cavity, resting on the bare stone of its floor, were two objects. The first was a military helmet, German from the First World War, the distinctive curved shape with the small brim and the central lug on the crown that she had seen in photographs. It had rusted completely, the surface, a deep uniform brown-red, the metal still holding its shape after more than 100 years, but surrendered entirely to oxidation. It sat on the stone floor of the cavity with the terrible stillness of things that have outlasted what they were made for. The second object was a photograph, small and rectangular, perhaps 3 inches by 4, the surface silvered and dark with age, but the image still present, still legible. She picked it up carefully and brought it to the window light. 4 young men. They were standing in a field in uniform, and they were smiling the way young men smile when they are 19 or 20, and the camera is out, and they cannot yet imagine what is coming. They were standing in a row with their arms over each other's shoulders, the posture of men who know each other so well, they do not need to think about standing close together. Behind them was a landscape she could not read, flat and dark, the horizon low. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in ink that had faded to brown but was still readable, Verdun, 1916. Hans, Friedrich, Klaus, Otto. She stood with the photograph in her hands in the stained glass light and understood. Harold was beside her. She handed him the photograph. He looked at it for a long time and then looked at the helmet in the cavity. She said he carried it here from Germany. Harold said nothing. She said he built the whole chapel around it. She said he put his brother's helmet inside the wall and built the chapel around it, and then he opened the doors and let everyone in. Harold held the photograph in both hands and looked at it for a long time. His face was doing the things she had seen it do once before in the courtroom when he had finished speaking about his father. Not a single emotion, but several of them moving through in sequence, each one giving way to the next. He said he didn't build a monument to his grief. He built a place where other people could bring theirs. He set the photograph down on the altar stone very carefully, face up, and stood looking at the 4 young men in the field at Verdun in 1916, who were smiling because they did not know yet what was coming. The raven called from the maples outside. Neither of them moved for a long time. They replaced the facing stone carefully after a while. Elaine Dodd, when Kara called her that evening, said she could connect her with a historical preservation contact at the County Museum in Herkimer, who would know the correct procedure for documenting and protecting the find. But they decided before the call was over that they would not remove the helmet from the wall. It had been placed there by the man who built the building, and it had been there for 100 years, and it was not a museum piece. It was a reason. It was why the building existed, and it was right that it should stay where it had always been, in the wall, in the building holding the building up. Kara commissioned a small wooden cabinet from a craftsman in Little Falls. It was simple and unvarnished with a glass front and a small brass latch. She hung it on the interior wall of the chapel beside the altar, at the same height as the cavity in the stone. Inside the cabinet, she put the photograph, The four young men, Verdun, 1916, Hans and Friedrich and Klaus and Otto, smiling in the field. Below the photograph, she placed a small card in a frame that she had written herself. It said, "This chapel was built alone, stone by stone, between 1923 and 1927 by Otto Brandt of Dusseldorf, Germany. He built it for every man who came home, but never really came home." Harold came with her the day she hung the cabinet. They stood in front of it for a while in the afternoon light. Outside, the first real warmth of spring was beginning to work on the clearing, the snow receding from the south-facing base of the chapel wall, and the first green showing through the dead leaves at the edge of the tree line. Harold said, "My father would have wanted to see this." Kara said she thought he had in a way. Harold looked at her sideways. She said, "He sat in this building for 19 years. He sat in front of that wall. He may not have known what was in it, but he was sitting with it the whole time." Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I think that's right." He left in the late afternoon, and she sat alone in the front pew, as she often did in the evenings, in the hour between the closing of the doors and full dark. The sun had dropped low enough that it came through the window at a flat angle and lit only the upper section of the opposite wall, a narrow band of blue and gold, and the deep red at the center moving slowly across the stone as the light faded. She watched it until it was gone, and she did not try to hold it, because she had learned by now that the light came back every day and there was no need to hold it. The spring came in gradually, the way spring comes to the foothills of the Adirondacks, not in a single arrival, but in a series of small ones, each one advancing the territory of warmth a little farther into the cold. The path dried, the creek rose for a week with snowmelt and then settled back. The birches at the edge of the clearing put out their first small leaves, pale green and translucent, the color of new things that have not yet decided what they are going to be. The visitors multiplied with the warming weather. She counted 47 separate visitors in the month of April, a number she knew not because she kept a formal count, but because the wooden box beside the door filled with notes in a way that told her something about the traffic through the building. She did not read all of them. They were not hers to read. She kept the box as a receptacle, a place for people to put things they needed to put somewhere. And she trusted that the box was doing its job by the weight of it. She kept one note from that month. A man had left it in late March, written on a torn corner of a paper bag in block letters with what appeared to be a carpenter's pencil. It said, "My son came home from 2 tours and couldn't sleep for 4 years. He sat in here for one afternoon. He slept that night. We don't know why. We're grateful." She kept that one in the inside pocket of her notebook next to Constance Marr's letter in the deed of sale from Herkimer County. The summer came with its long days and full canopy, the clearing dappled with moving light through the dense green overhead. She learned the sounds of the full-leaf forest, which were different from the sounds of the open canopy spring and winter, more layered, more various. The birds changing as the season changed. She learned that the chapel was coolest at midday in summer because of the thermal mass of the stone walls, which made it a refuge from the heat in a way that she had not anticipated. People came to sit in the coolness of it as much as for any other reason, which seemed to her exactly right. Another form of shelter the building was capable of providing without being asked. One afternoon in July, toward the end of the month, when the days were longest and the heat in the clearing was significant, even in the shade of the maples, a man came up the path and stood in the clearing doorway of the chapel and looked at the building for a very long time before he came inside. He was in his mid-60s, heavy-set, wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled up and boots that had seen real use. He had the kind of face that does not give much away until it does, and when he came inside and sat in one of the middle pews, he sat the way a man sits when he is not sure he has the right to take up space somewhere. He stayed for 3 hours. Kara went in and out of the shelter doing the small maintenance tasks that occupied her afternoons, and she let him alone. When he came out, it was late afternoon, and the light through the stained glass window was at its best, the colors rich and deep, and he stood on the stone threshold for a moment and looked back at the window from outside. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a folded piece of paper and put it in the wooden box beside the door without looking at Kara. Then he walked back across the clearing and down the path without saying anything at all. She read the note that evening in the shelter by lamplight. It said 2 tours, 1968 and 1969. I never told my kids. I never told anyone. I don't know why I came here today, but I think I needed somewhere that didn't require an explanation. She folded the note carefully and put it with the others in the box lined with dark velvet. She sat for a while at the writing table in the shelter with the lamp burning and thought about the man in the work shirt and his 2 tours and his children who did not know, and the long road from 1969 to a Tuesday afternoon in a stone chapel in the Adirondack foothills. She told Harold about the note the next morning when he came up the path with his tool roll over his shoulder. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the chapel door. Then he said, "That's what this place is for." He said it the way he said the things that mattered most, without emphasis, as if they were simply true and had always been true and did not require a performance to confirm them. She said, "I know." They went inside and got to work. Harold was teaching her that summer how to work the stone using Otto's drawings as the guide, applying the same techniques in the same sequence, working on the sections of wall that needed attention with the same tools and the same methods that had built the building in the first place. There was something in this that she could not fully articulate, but that she felt clearly in the work itself, a continuity that was almost physical, as if the knowledge were being passed hand to hand across the decades from Otto to Harold to her, and that each person who received it took on some small portion of the responsibility for the thing that had been built with it. By the time the second autumn came around, turning the maples in the clearing, the same extraordinary orange gold they had been when she first walked into it a year earlier, she had 140 pages in the notebook. She did not know if it was a book. She had never written a book. But it was something, and she kept writing. She wrote about Otto Brandt and the 4 years he spent alone in these woods, building something out of grief and skill and the belief that silence was its own form of offering. She wrote about Hester Vane and the brother who had come home from the Pacific with something wrong behind his eyes and had found in these pews the first peace he had known in 6 months. She wrote about Harold and his father and the 19 calendars with the small notation T gone, and all the falls Thomas Goss had walked this mile of path carrying what he carried and set it down for a little while and then picked it back up and driven home. She wrote about the man in the work shirt and his 2 tours and his children who did not know. She wrote about herself as little as possible and only as the connecting tissue between the things that mattered more. On an evening in late September, she was sitting on the stone bench outside the chapel door, watching the light change when 2 deer came into the clearing from the north side, through the gap in the trees near the granite boulder. They moved without hurry, their steps placed with the certainty of animals that know their territory. They did not see her. She was still enough, and the wind was right, and they moved through the clearing within 20 feet of where she sat. Their coats, the deep red-brown of the turning maples, their eyes dark and calm. She watched them until they disappeared into the trees on the south side of the clearing, and she sat for a while after they were gone in the growing dark with the chapel behind her and the stained glass window holding the last light of the day in its faded colors. She thought about Otto Brandt walking into these woods in 1923 with grief and his brother's helmet and a stonemason's knowledge and 4 years of patience. She thought about Hester Vane writing her letter in 1971, knowing she was writing to someone she would never meet, trusting that the person would come. She thought about Thomas Goss driving up from Little Falls every October and walking the mile path in the fall leaves and sitting in a pew without explanation for 19 years, carrying whatever he was carrying, setting it down for a little while, picking it back up when he left, because you always had to pick it back up, but lighter, a little lighter. She thought about her mother, about the evenings she had read aloud to her mother in the last weeks when her mother was too tired to hold the book herself, about the small notebook her mother kept in her purse, the one where she wrote down the things Kara said that she wanted to remember. She did not know what was in that notebook. She had not been able to find it after her mother died, and she had eventually understood that it was gone, lost in the way that the most specific and irreplaceable things are sometimes lost without ceremony, without reason. But it had existed. Her mother had kept it. That was the thing that mattered, and the thing she could not lose because she had carried it with her since she was small without knowing she was carrying it. The 33 gold sovereigns were in a felt-lined box she had made for them. She had spoken with a curator at the Herkimer County Historical Society in September, a careful woman named Patricia Eames, who had come out to the chapel and spent a full afternoon with the coins and the documentation Kara had assembled. The coins were genuine, the dates consistent with the timeline of Otto's life, and the Historical Society was interested in receiving them as a donation together with Otto's drawing and a selection of the letters from the box for their collection. Kara had agreed to this in principle. She was going to keep one coin. She knew which one. It was the earliest in the collection, dated 1891. The face worn nearly smooth with decades of handling, the kind of object that has been touched so many times, it has absorbed something of all those touchings. She was going to keep the photograph of the four young men at Verdun. She was going to keep Hester Vane's letter. She was going to keep the deed. She was going to keep the first note she had read in the leather pouch, the one the hiker had left on the second day Korea 1950. I haven't forgotten. She went inside and lit the candle in the stone niche beside the altar and stood for a moment looking at the photograph in the cabinet beside it. Hans Friedrich Klaus Otto. Verdun, 1916. The four of them with their arms over each other's shoulders in the flat, dark landscape behind them, in the ordinary happiness of young men who have not yet learned what they are about to learn. She thought about what Harold had said when he first saw the photograph and understood what Otto had done. He didn't build a monument to his grief. He built a place where other people could bring theirs. That was the whole of it, she thought. That was the thing that Otto had understood when he was young and broken and walking into these woods with a dead brother's helmet in his hands. That grief held alone is just grief. But grief given a place to rest, grief allowed to sit in company with other grief, even across the years and decades, grief built into the walls of a building that anyone could walk into and leave something of themselves in, that grief becomes something else. Not less, not easier, but shared. And sharing it even silently, even anonymously, even across the distance of decades, was what the chapel had been built for. She walked out and closed the heavy oak doors behind her with the careful sound of the iron latch settling into its place. The sound she had heard every evening for more than a year, and had come to think of as punctuation, the end of the day's sentence, the promise that there would be another sentence tomorrow. She went to the shelter and lit the lamp and sat at the narrow writing table under the small east window and opened her notebook to the page where she had left off. The lamp threw its warm circle across the page. Outside the clearing was dark and quiet, the first stars showing through the canopy, the forest settling into its nighttime version of itself, deeper and more layered than the daytime version. Full of sounds she had learned and sounds she had not yet learned, and the underlying presence of the stone building 30 feet away, with its walls full of everything that had been brought here over 100 years and set down. She dipped her pen. Her mother had kept a notebook for the things she wanted to remember. Kara was keeping a larger one. It would take 2 more years to finish. It would be published with the title she had known since February, since the morning she had sat in the front pew with Hester Vane's letter open on her knees, and understood something about what the building was for, and why it had been built, and why it had waited, and what waiting at its best actually was. She had carried the title in the back of her mind through the legal fight, in the long winter and the first spring and the full summer, and into this second autumn, and it had never felt wrong, not even once. The quiet was always there, but that was later. Right now she was 21 years old and sitting at Otto Brandt's writing table in Otto Brandt's shelter behind the chapel he had built stone by stone for every person who ever came home carrying something they could not put down anywhere else. And the lamp was burning, and the page was open, and somewhere outside in the dark clearing the raven settled into the maples for the night, and the creek moved over its stones at the bottom of the hill. And the chapel stood in the darkness, the way it had stood for 100 years still, and certain and full of the quiet it had been built to hold, waiting without impatience for whoever would come next. She had spent $1. She had given it a voice.